Hello, I'm Hania Salah, Deputy Director at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you everyone for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess on her memoir, The Cat I Never Named, a true story of love, war, and survival. Amra is Associate Professor of Practice and Project Director at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education at Columbia University's Teachers College. Her work is focused on understanding how and why societies fall apart and what role education can play in rebuilding decimated countries. Her most recent research examines the role of education in radicalization and de-radicalization. Dr. Amra grew up in Bihać, Bosnia and Herzegovina. After surviving ethnic cleansing in more than 1,100 days under the Serbs' military siege, she emigrated to the United States in 1996. By December 1999, she had earned a BA in economics from Brown University, followed by 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from Columbia University. We are very thankful to have Amra with us to share her moving and harrowing journey. In The Cat I Never Named, she recalls her personal experience at a pivotal period of Bosniak history. As a Bosnian genocide survivor, Amra's memoir presents a deeply human narrative of hope and resilience, despite the backdrop of inhumane atrocities and tragedy. Amra was a young Muslim teen when she became exposed to the crude realities of war. During the Serbian siege on her city, her family and friends were killed because of their Muslim heritage. Raw, real, and emotional, the memoir is an inspiring story of survival of the human spirit, while bearing witness to how dangerous visceral, ethnic, racial, and religious hatred is. Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess' powerful voice is especially significant today as we work to deepen the nature of global dialogue and social justice. I would now like to hand over to our moderator, Samira Shackle. Samira is a freelance writer and reporter based in London, writing features focusing on the human impact of major world events. She is the editor of the new Humanist Magazine and a regular contributor to The Guardian's long read section. Samira was a media fellow with Columbia University's Center for the Study of Social Difference. Her first book, Karachi Vice, that tells the story of 5 ordinary citizens of Pakistan's largest city, will be published early next year. Before I turn it over to Samira, I would like to remind you all to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Over to you, Samira.
Thank you, Hania, and thank you everyone for joining us. So The Cat I Never Named has been characterized by reviewers as a book that recreates both the beauty and brutality of these years. That's from the Booklist starred review. And from Publishers Weekly, a book about the transformative power of love, connection, and education. It's a book that's been written with young adult readers in mind, but it's equally compelling for adults. It's an incredibly absorbing emotional story, as well as being a deeply informative account of the horrors of war in general and of this specific conflict, which happened within our living memory. And for me in the UK, sitting in Europe, so close by. So as one reader and reviewer wrote, though the goal of this book is to engage the minds of young adult readers to teach lessons about resilience, love for family and education, tolerance and acceptance, regardless of the intersection of one's race, ethnicity, gender, class, religion, and sexual orientation, its universal appeal can attract any reader of any age, place, or time. The Cat I Never Named also holds relevance to current events. So unfortunately, as we're all aware, the nationalist and Islamophobic ideologies that underpinned the Bosnian genocide can still be seen around the world today. And in many places, they're only becoming more pronounced. So across the globe, in countries like the US, in France, Nigeria, India, to name just a few, we see anti-Islam rhetoric on the increase. And as Amra can attest, we have painfully and in living memory seen where such dark currents can lead us. So I'll now hand over to Amra, who'll talk more about the book and will also give us a reading. So over to you, Amra.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those wonderful introductory words to both of you. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I am grateful to Colombia's Global Center in Amman for inviting me to talk about my recently published memoir, The Cat I Never Named, A True Story of Love, War, and Survival. In particular, I want to thank Hania Salah for her kind words, as well as her team members, Dr. Ahmed Al-Musa and Duna Dabas, who worked on organizing this event. And of course, my most sincere thanks to Samira Shackle, a journalist and a fellow author. I will begin our hour together by sharing a bit of background on The Cat I Never Named, followed by my reading of a section from my memoir. Samira and I will then engage in a conversation and answer some of your questions. The Cat I Never Named is a story of a young Bosnian girl surviving genocide that may at first seem distant and perhaps not relatable to many of you. But the violence, social unrest, Islamophobia, and racism we're seeing today in the United States and around the world evoke memories of killing and ethnic cleansing I had survived during the Bosnian genocide. Though I have done quite a few talks since the book's publication in mid-September, I have to admit that it never gets easier. Speaking with you today requires that I travel back to a place of intense emotions and vivid memories of the Bosnian War. As anyone who has lived through trauma knows, we tend to internalize tragic experiences rather than place them on a public display. To begin, I want to start by sharing some of the context behind the Bosnian War, especially for those of you not familiar with the reasons behind that war. I grew up in a small town of Bihać in the former Yugoslavia, in the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. At the time, Yugoslavia consisted of 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions, but the Republic of Serbia was really the dominant player and in control of the nation's politics, economy, and military. As communism came to an end in early 1990s, this cobbled together nation of Yugoslavia started to fall apart. And individual republics sought their independence. Instead of independence and equal rights for all, Serbia wanted to turn Yugoslavia into an ethnically pure nation called Greater Serbia. This led to multiple wars. First, Serbia attacked Slovenia, then occupied a portion of Croatia. Bosnia was ethnically diverse. So once Serbia attacked Bosnia, the bloodshed was particularly gruesome. Bosnian Muslims stood in the way of an ethnically clean Greater Serbia. So one of Serbia's key military and political goals became to kill and eradicate Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. I was one of those Muslims. By June of 1992, the Serb army besieged my city. We no longer had access to food, electricity, phones, or the outside world. So Serbs got to frame Bosnia's narrative. The city was under military siege for 1,150 days, longer than the infamous siege of Leningrad lasted during World War II. It felt as if I stood in a quickly moving line for execution, waiting for my turn. We were bombed constantly. Every day, the Serb army killed someone I loved, I knew, or I played with. Today, you may have noticed on my left arm that I'm wearing a white armband. In parts of Bosnia that Serbia occupied, Muslims like me were ordered to wear white armbands to signal to Serbs that we could be killed or raped. The act of cutting this band from an old Bosnian undershirt evoked pain, but with it, I honored the victims of Bosnian genocide and all victims of merciless killings driven by hate, anti-Muslim racism, and all forms of racism and discrimination around the world. They will never have a chance to stand before you and tell their stories. Today, I also want to share with you a few snippets of my story. During the war, we often starved, and one time my mother wanted to use our last bit of money to cross the enemy line to where we knew others had gone to trade with the Serb soldiers. By that time in the war, my mom was already deaf from a bomb that hit our home. So I insisted on going with her. The two of us had hoped to buy cooking oil, flour, or salt. We crossed into the no man's land between the Serb and Bosnian soldiers. We knew some of those who dared to walk through that area before us had lost their limbs because of mines, but we were desperate. For Serb soldiers, we were usually just vermin, free for them to shoot at or capture, theirs to use. But when they could make money off of our desperation, they didn't mind. When my mom and I got to them, they laughed at our audacity in standing in front of their bunkers and artillery. We asked if they had any food they could sell to us. Within minutes, one of the drunken soldiers had grabbed me, and as my mom struggled to pull me away, a Muslim soldier fired a shot to help us escape. While the shooting ensued, my mother and I were crawling back through the minefield. I didn't even think about being blown up. Anything was better than being raped by those leering, cruel men. I cried on our way back home, disgusted at life, at us, at our desperation, and the world, at everything around us. All of humanity was infected with hate. And all this was happening to me because I am a Muslim who never prayed, just a Muslim by birth and blood. For that, I was marked. Though the war ended years ago, many parts of me were and are still broken. At one point, I was displaced from my home and silenced from telling my story. Today, I'm a professor at Columbia University's Teachers College, and one of the projects I'm working on deals with a concept I call educational displacement. I examine how students can begin to feel marginalized and excluded, at times even radicalized, if their voices are not heard or if their identities are not valued in the classroom. Like refugees who can be forcefully displaced from their homes, so can our students feel displaced if our curricula fail to embrace their diversity. It pains me that in today's America and many countries around the world, our young people feel broken and educationally displaced in our schools. Their pain and discrimination need to be heard, seen, discussed, and addressed in our classrooms. We cannot undo what has been done in the past, but we can acknowledge, heal, and change our future. I cannot undo what has been done to me. Years of my life and people I loved were stolen from me, but other elements of who I had become are more resilient and determined, giving me the strength to leave Bosnia after the war and immigrate into the United States in January of 1996 with a few dollars in my pocket. I hope that the stories I share in The Cat I Never Named serve to educate, inspire, and build resilience. For me, this year marks 25 years since I first walked into a classroom as a teenager, yet a teacher. I taught during the genocide in Bosnia, as many of our teachers were gone, killed, or injured at that time. At Columbia, I have taught courses on subjects ranging from statistics to radicalization, but a common thread weaves through my work. I recognize the power of storytelling to inspire change, resilience, and collective empathy. And as I thank you once again for being here, I would like to end by reading a section from my book that describes a moment when I find myself crossing the main bridge in my hometown. In this scene, I am on my way to see a friend and tell her that school is about to start again. Like during this global pandemic, we didn't have normal schooling during the war either. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, It is because it's flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound, so the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we are about to die, but our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I am not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams, and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure. But the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back towards the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open, and at first, I think the sound he is making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ear one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming, a long, drawn-out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened, but this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reaching out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar, made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There is nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb. Like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand, and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke, though it's a midday. The smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor. Not amongst the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There is nothing I can do. So I leave him. It is a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see, their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge, draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like me. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find the bloody horror. The front of her body stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab. Wiping my bloody hands on the ground, they make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, haul myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with tall blue letters on the side, UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. "Help is here," I shout to the little boy as I pass him. "These men will help you." I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. "Please have medics," I think. "Please have some kind of counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face." But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching, and it doesn't care. Thank you.
Thank you, Amra. That was an incredibly powerful reading and a really useful introduction to the book as well. You mentioned there that it's challenging in some ways, both writing about this material and then talking about the book that you've written. And I think it's probably quite clear to people listening why that is, having heard the reading and how kind of visceral these experiences are that you're describing. So to write so vividly about events of long ago, you must really be putting yourself back into those moments. So I wondered if you could tell me a bit about what it's like revisiting some of these memories and what made you decide to write this book.
Thank you. And yes, before we started, I did share that it never, and as I did in my initial remarks, it does never get easier. But there was a particular moment in my personal life here in New York, in the US, that happened a couple of years ago that made me change my mind about really going out public and speaking on these issues through the story, through my story, through The Cat I Never Named. And it was my third grader, my younger daughter, Dina, who is this wonderful, gifted girl who loves math and science and seahorses and is always happy, who came one day from school and asked me bluntly, "Mom, what will happen to me and Jana, her older sister, if you and Dad are rounded up as Muslims and taken away? Will we be left alone?" And that moment for me to experience was really a jolting experience. Here I was, a faculty member and a researcher at Columbia University, traveling around the world, trying to fix problems in educational systems around the world. And my child, born and raised in New York City, was sharing the same fears I had before genocide against Bosnian Muslims unfolded in former Yugoslavia or in Bosnia. And that was the moment when I decided that in a way, I was abdicating my responsibility as a genocide survivor to lend my story to educators around the world, to use it in the classroom spaces at university level, at the high school level, to really teach and educate how far hatred can go and how important it is to be inclusive in education and to give voices that counter this kind of visceral hatred that, as you noted in your remarks, is on the rise around the world today.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there, you know, some of those fears that your daughter expressed were fears that you had yourself before the war broke out and the genocide began. I wondered if you could just share a little bit about your life before the war broke out, so following the breakup of Yugoslavia and before that, and when you became aware of these prejudices and hatred against Muslims.
I think anyone who reads the official description of this story as a story of a genocide survivor may by default be inclined to think that this is not something that can happen to me. This happens in distant time, in distant places, and is unlikely to happen in my society. And that is perspective that I certainly had before the war, as the narrative of hatred started to emerge. And in terms of my own self-awareness, I was always deeply aware that I was discriminated against in the context of former Yugoslavia. Bosnian Muslims were treated as second-class citizens, and we were clearly communicated that we were lesser than the rest. However, despite that, I never imagined that it would go as far as it did in 1992 with the start of genocide. And I will say that in terms of how and when I first noticed that my society didn't want me represented in its educational system, in its political system, and in its economy, in terms of the top echelons and the elites, was when I was second and third grade. I remember vividly searching for stories that would have a Muslim girl name in it. I've never read a story growing up in former Yugoslavia that had Amra in it or any other Muslim boy or child's name in it. I was very much a math and physics nerd, and I solved every world problem that was out there. And again, never encountered any form of representation of my own identity. So I was deeply aware that I was intended to be silent, participatory in my society. And it really didn't matter who I was. What mattered was how I was depicted as less worthy of success of life or belonging, sense of belonging in former Yugoslavia. But I truly never imagined before the war started. I was a 16-year-old girl who played volleyball, competed in math and physics, and who was about to fall in love with the boy. And I didn't expect to be escaping concentration camps and rape camps and starving for years of my life.
Yeah, of course. And that's something that your book really captures, is the fact that you were at a formative age. You were 16 when the war broke out. And so it's a kind of story about, in a way, being a teenager and having these, you know, this crucial part of your life at the same time as enduring this unimaginable horror of war. So what was that like, and how do you think your age at the time of the war affected your experience of it?
In some ways, probably that was the worst age to experience surviving genocide, because I was not young enough, as some of younger friends or relatives who don't remember vividly certain scenes or moments or experiences in pain and trauma, who are now reading my book and thanking me for it because they didn't experience it in the same way. At the same time, I was not an adult, and being 16 through 20 during the war, I was forced to really, in a way, skip what should have been and could have been the most innocent and beautiful part of growing up. That being said, this book, to a surprising level, probably for many, has many beautiful aspects of growing up despite the genocide. And that is a reflection of not just my own resilience, but my friends and those that survived the war together with me. So there are funny moments, and there are some, I would say, tragic and comic moments at the same time of us really struggling to retain any sense of normalcy that we could at that time. But psychologically, probably it was the worst age range that one could have experienced this type of brutal war. And clearly, the fact that I continue to professionally and personally engage in all sorts of initiatives that counter hatred, that work to end Islamophobia, that work to build social cohesion in our societies through education, is a reflection how deeply that experience affected me. I have become who I am today because of what I had survived.
Yeah, of course. And it's such a kind of, at any age, huge thing to go through, but let alone when you're so young, as you say. And one of the things that becomes a symbol of resilience in your book is the cat of the title. So that's The Cat I Never Named. Could you tell us about who that cat was and why it was never named?
Well, the cat I never named was one and only. She was truly special. So my father and I encountered her, and in the book and in life, we called her Maci. Maci in Bosnian means kitty or a cat. My father and I encountered many refugees arriving into our city just before the siege, days before the siege started. And with refugees, we encountered this incredible little kitty who attached herself to us, followed us home, and refused to leave us. I do have to say, and I am genuine and honest about this in the book, that we did not want to take her in as a pet. My mom didn't want hair on the furniture. We didn't have enough food to feed ourselves, let alone to worry about another living being. But Maci didn't care. She simply would not leave us. And then the war started. We spent some of the first days of the war or the siege in a basement of a neighbor's house in our neighborhood who, because my home didn't have the basement, and my parents took our entire family there, but Maci stayed at home. And on June 12th, 1992, the very first day of bombing of my city, my brother and I decided to escape this basement without telling our parents and go back to our house to see Maci. And in the process, we encountered 4 of our girlfriends who were hanging out outside on the street because the bombing subsided for a few hours, and we didn't have the experience of living through war at that point. This was the first day of bombing. So we assumed maybe the war is over. Maybe this means that Serbs have stopped bombing us and we can go back to normal life. And so they were excited and playing outside. When my brother and I decided to walk away from them and look for Maci, we both walked, Dino and I, in 2 different directions. And in that moment, a bomb hit 4 of our friends and blew their bodies apart into pieces. And so that was the first moment where Maci really, by the set of circumstances in which we found ourselves, in a way saved our life. If we didn't walk away to look for her, my brother and I would have been killed on the very first day of the war. So there would be no The Cat I Never Named. There would be no story to tell today. And she represents that savior throughout the entire story. She was a source of happiness for us and helped us both physically and emotionally really survive through incredibly difficult time. And she was a symbol of this unparalleled love and loyalty, where someone loved us in a way that didn't judge us for who we were. And in some ways, we received that love from her when we felt we were largely receiving only hatred from the humans on the hills around our besieged city.
Yeah, it's an amazing testament to the power of the kind of unconditional love that you can get from a pet or from a from another animal. And you kind of alluded there to the feeling of being hated, and I'm interested in that because you obviously had so many truly harrowing experiences, but also you've mentioned several times the fact of being on the receiving end of this treatment and going through all of this merely by an accident of birth. It's just to do with the community that you're born into. It's nothing to do with anything else. And I wonder, particularly for such a young person, what that is like psychologically, to know that, this is it's an aspect of your identity you can't do anything about, and that's causing you to be such a target.
That's an excellent question, because I think a lot of people who are in a similar position, even if they're not surviving genocide or war, but they may be hated because of their race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, will probably relate to this feeling. It is extremely painful to begin to become aware, particularly in the educational system, as I mentioned, that I am so viscerally hated, that nothing I do can in a way please the society and allow me to gain that sense of belonging and acceptance and respect that I think all of us hope to have within our communities. And there was one moment when I particularly struggled with it, and I described this in the book when just before the war starts, my parents actually approached me and asked me if I would be willing to get on a plane, a military plane at the time of the Serbia's army that would depart from a military airport outside of my city and go to Serbia, where I had one uncle who was Serb, who was married into my mother's family, and they had hoped that he could arrange for that trip and save me. But there was one condition, that as a 16-year-old girl, I had to disown my identity, and I had to take on a Serb name and pretend to be a Serb girl in hope that no one would recognize me, no one would realize I was a Muslim in order to survive. And at that moment, when my parents suggested this, this was before siege was full and completed, and in fact, that military airport was damaged and during the war, destroyed by Serbia so that none of us could leave or use it for other purposes. That was the moment when I realized that I just couldn't escape who I am. I am who I am, and I had to come to terms with that. And that the hatred that was so visceral and directed at me wasn't really a reflection of who I was. If I took on a Serb identity or any other identity, I would have been the same person. It was really a reflection of how I was seen, how I was depicted, what kind of narrative, Islamophobic narrative was created in former Yugoslavia that portrayed me as this danger, as this form of ethnic impurity. And that was the moment when I decided to own who I am. And I am glad that I did. Of course, I am saddened that my life took the course that it did, and I had to survive genocide simply for being Muslim. But I am also grateful for all of those hardships, because they had made me who I am. They had shaped who I am as a person, and I think they've made me a much more empathetic to the causes of other excluded groups and marginalized groups in the world today. But that struggle is hard for anyone who experiences it, and it's something that leaves a deep, deep scar that is lifelong.
Yeah, I mean, those are huge things to come to terms with at any age. And I think probably to the extent that lots of people don't ever really directly confront those kinds of questions. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about the psychological effect of that. And that obviously, you know, we've mentioned at various points, including in the introduction, and you alluded to it just then, the fact that this kind of Islamophobia is on the rise and is certainly being seen around the world. And while it might not always be manifesting in exactly the same way or to the same level of extremity as you experienced, it is something that's around these kind of hyper-nationalist and often Islamophobic narratives. So are there particular lessons that you would like people to take from reading your story?
Well, I think there are many lessons, but one of them is that we should never underestimate the power of those kinds of stories that are built around the idea of exclusion and othering and hatred and Islamophobia and racism. I'll share one detail that in late 1980s in Serbia, Slobodan Milošević emerged as one of those powerful, really and impactful orators who advocated for this vision of Greater Serbia as ethnically pure, and delivered in 1989, he delivered a speech referencing the Kosovo battle that happened in Kosovo 600 years prior, in which Ottomans defeated Serbs. And he evoked that kind of imagery, violence and hostility towards the other, and started to really other non-Serbs in former Yugoslavia. I have to say that at that time, many of us underestimated the power of that narrative. And I certainly as a team thought that it was a ridiculous approach to multi-ethnic society that we at that time lived in, particularly because Bosnia was highly diverse. But I think the audience that you have here is brilliant and can deduce what the parallels between that context and what we've seen in the United States and Western Europe in particular over the last couple of years are in terms of the rise of white supremacy and far-right groups who actually are looking to Bosnian genocide as a form of inspiration for what they hope to achieve in Western societies because of this tension of growing multicultural and multi-ethnic environments in Western societies as well. And I, in fact, recently wrote in Al Jazeera a piece looking specifically at these parallels between narrative of Islamophobia that emerged in former Yugoslavia and the narrative used today by white supremacists who are looking at genocide in Bosnia as a form of success, because the reality is that many thousands of Muslims were executed. The country remains in large part ethnically cleansed for a Muslim population. And so it is a representation of this fantasy that continues to live on and is live and well, unfortunately, here in the United States and in Europe.
That's absolutely horrifying to hear that that it's being cited as an example by white supremacists. That must be really difficult, particularly as a survivor, to see. So we're moving on. I'm going to include some audience questions and probably interspersed with some more of my own. But there's one audience question that's come up from a couple of people, which I think is quite relevant to what we're talking about now. And that's about the specific relevance of your story in the educational context. So one person has a specific question, which is whether the book's suitable for students in grade 8, so aged around 14. And if you have any examples of how the book could be used in school curricula. And we've got a related question from someone asking whether it's important to examine how universities teach political science courses as a way to address the roots of discrimination and hatred. So maybe you could talk a bit about those two things.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, my hope for this story, for the book, was to really be used in educational context. And I have to say that as someone I've taught statistics courses when I initially started teaching at Columbia. And I always vividly remember these moments when my students just wouldn't see the connection to the numbers, would not see connection to the importance of statistics and trends until I was able to couch that information in a meaningful story. How do these numbers actually impact lived experiences of marginalized, discriminated communities? So today I have students who are in ministries of education around the world or who run schools in other countries and who are in touch with me and who say, Amra, something that you had shared or a story you had shared is what continues to guide the work that I do. And that was in part in addition to my concern and the question I shared that my daughter raised about Islamophobia in the United States. That was really the reason why I thought that writing my story would allow teachers, whether they're at the high school level or they are at the college level, to use this story to humanize the experience of hatred. And so the story is specifically written in a way that is accessible to anyone who is 12 years and up. So that's the official ranking for, to answer directly the question of someone who asked, what's the appropriate age group? It does, obviously, as you've heard, deal with difficult subjects, but a frequent response that I've gotten from teens is that they're so glad I am not tiptoeing around the issues that often teachers tiptoe around because they don't have the content and the materials to really adequately engage, particularly with the question of Islamophobia in, let's say, American classrooms. And there is a website that I had worked with, I think it's called Teaching Books, but they can always, whoever asked that question, they can reach out to me separately, where we created some of the curricular activities that could be used in the classroom. I am speaking in a predominantly immigrant kids school with large Muslim kids population. In fact, in 2 weeks from now here in the United States, who are so excited to finally have a story that in which a teen struggles with some of the issues that they're struggling with themselves. And I think in some ways it allows young adults to not only develop their own sense of resilience, but understand that they're not alone in this hope for belonging in the societies that often paint them as different or sometimes dangerous, as we all well know in the context of Islamophobia. And in terms of teaching political science at the college levels, I, as someone who has used mixed methods in my own research, I've used quantitative, qualitative methods. And I would say, I think an important element of what is missing often in the context of teaching political science is this aspect of storytelling, this aspect of really relating to future political scientists, what are the consequential impacts of racism and discrimination and exclusion and Islamophobia. And I think incorporating a story like The Cat I Never Named, I hope becomes a norm in the context of studying political science at college level and beyond.
Thank you so much. There's a few questions about your move to the US, and that's something I'd also wanted to ask about your how that came about, your move. So one of the specific questions is also not only your move to the US, but whether you've since returned to Bihać, and also, you know, why you chose the US, how you ended up there.
Thank you. So there was a point in the war when I decided, and I really expected to not survive the war, but I decided as a young person that I was going to make my time meaningful, whatever that time was. And as part of that, I had mentioned I became a teacher to fifth graders through high schoolers, even though I was only 17, 18 years old at that time myself. But I also started working with local doctors and nurses who were working on immunizing children. We're talking about, in the context of pandemic, a lot about immunization, but in the context of war, being under the siege, we were not able to get any vaccination implemented, except for occasional times when humanitarian convoy would come in and UNICEF would send immunization equipment and shots for kids in the besieged city. So I would go to the front lines with the nurses and doctors and look for children that we would immunize. And in that process, I met two psychologists who came in the last year of the war from the International Rescue Committee, which is a well-known international NGO. And they wanted to survey the state of the schools. And they asked me for help to take them to schools and teachers and principals. And that is what I did. And in one conversation with one of my teachers, these two young Americans, their names were Drew and Wayne. I have tried, and maybe Samira, as a journalist, you can help me. I've tried to locate them. I have not been able to find them, even though I've contacted IRC and I've contacted various organizations to locate them. But these two young men who came on behalf of IRC met one of my teachers who told them, look, you're not going to save all of us. We are going to die. But at least save Amra if you can. And Wayne turned to me and said, would you like to come and study in the United States? And of course, I thought it was a crazy proposition simply because I didn't see a way out of a besieged city at the time. But my understanding is that after they left Bihać, and I never saw them again, that they did. I did give them all of my original transcripts, all of my awards, my original birth certificate, because I didn't think it would matter really. And they came to New York City, spoke at the board meeting of the International Rescue Committee. And one of the board members, his name was David Pincus, he got up and he asked them, is there a life that I could save? And they gave him my documents and they said, maybe you can save this young woman. And the rest was history. David Pincus made it his mission, and he connected to a professor from Harvard, Michael Sells, who I believe is now at the University of Chicago, who was trying to save some Bosnian Muslim teens at the time and bring them to school here in the United States. And I initially had a scholarship to study at Chestnut Hill College, which is an all-girls school in Philadelphia. I didn't speak English. I taught myself English during the war, so that was the knowledge I had when I came here. So they allowed me to use one of those, in those days, they were TDK tapes, small recorders, and I would record lectures and then spend my days and nights translating them and memorizing things in English. And a year and a half later, I applied to Brown and transferred to Brown on a full scholarship, and sort of the rest is history. But along the way, I was helped by many strangers of various backgrounds who made it their mission to make my life meaningful, and I'm grateful to all of them for that.
It's incredibly moving to hear about that. It's a real testament to the kindness of strangers. There's a question here that's a bit more personal, actually, which you might find interesting, from Facebook Live. And this person said, after being displaced, I cling more to my academic goals. I'm trying to create something for me. Do you think striving for these goals is a compromise or fulfilling a genuine aspiration?
That's an excellent question. And I tend to argue that seeing academic agenda and a personal agenda as mutually exclusive, especially with people who have such rich experiences of displacement and exclusion, who have value to add to those conversations, perhaps is a wrong way of looking at things. And I know that academia is very much at fault for that. I myself, when I started my academic career, was very much focused on quantitative, as I mentioned, quantitative methodologies and teaching statistics, because I thought that validated me. That sort of knowledge was deeply respected, and simply focusing on that would be a way to success. And I think all of those tools are incredibly important, but it is also essential that you do not take yourself as someone who has the experience of displacement from the work that you do. Because the questions that I ask, the way that I see the world, and my general set of perspectives on many issues is very, very different from academics who didn't have the same experiences as I did. And I think it's important to see value in that. And that will lead to a sense of self-empowerment. And once you are able to self-empower yourself, to own that experience, you will be able to empower others in the academic context. So I wish you good luck. And if whoever asked that question, and if you have further questions on that, I'm happy to informally mentor or guide you in those kinds of decisions going forward.
Oh, that's lovely. And there's a few questions around your recovery from a traumatic experience. So someone's asked, how does someone who witnesses a traumatic experience build resilience? Someone else has asked, what are the factors that have helped you to heal? They've also asked what motivates you to forgive, and I suppose there's an open question in that, you know, do you forgive even? But yeah, I think maybe if you could talk a bit about this question of emerging from trauma and healing and resilience.
It's not easy. I would lie when I would say, and as I shared before we officially started this webinar, I still have nightmares. I still relive some of these moments subconsciously. It is trauma or the kind of extensive trauma that I had survived is as I call it, the troll that's with me my entire life. And what becomes a reflection of resilience is not really forgetting it, but finding a way to live with it and finding a way to control those feelings and emotions and falling back into moments of depression, which I had experienced when I first realized that I was so viscerally hated during the war. And I talk about those moments in the book. But I think what allowed me, and that aspect becomes apparent in The Cat I Never Named as well, what allowed me to build my own resilience was this dedication to focusing on who I am rather than how I am seen or how I am depicted as a Muslim. And that aspect is external to me. I can't control someone viscerally hating me. I couldn't stop genocide or couldn't stop someone wanting to bomb and blow up my city and eradicate our existence. But what I could control was sitting down and memorizing every word of English from an old dictionary from my father and mastering some other form of knowledge that made me feel good about who I was. And so I focused on studying math and physics, despite the genocide, despite destruction that was happening around me. And though I couldn't see, or my work as a teacher or my work with immunization of children, I couldn't necessarily see how long-term that would help me. Now, looking back at that time, there was a purpose in that work. And that purpose was really to help me manage through that trauma, but also give me a sense of purpose that continues to be something that I build on in all the work that I do. And just in terms of that element of forgiveness that that was asked, I was, when I was a student doing my master's, one of the 2 master's degrees at Columbia at School of International Public Affairs, I was hired to be a team leader on a project in Bosnia, working on reintegration of former soldiers into the society. And that also involved working with formerly Serb soldiers who were potentially killing me, targeting me. And I remember being very honest with the leader of that project, a faculty member at the time, and sharing with her that I wanted to reserve my right to withdraw from the project if I felt that I just could not interact with Serb soldiers, and if I felt that I couldn't be in any way fair to them and couldn't see them simply as anyone else in the project. And that was a struggle to acknowledge that I could potentially be in a position where I can interact with someone because of the trauma that they triggered for me. But I did end up working through the project, and it was one of the most important experiences that I consider in my personal and professional career, because I helped some of these soldiers reintegrate. And I had one soldier who called me through tears and said, I cannot live with myself for what I had done to people like you. Why did you help me? And that was the moment when I became aware that I just couldn't hate. I couldn't hate and respond with hatred to those who wanted to eradicate me, because it would make equivalent to them. And I wanted nothing to do and wanted to ensure that I am never an individual who can forget her own humanity. And so I think engaging with your own feelings and with your own trauma and exploring who you are and who you want to be is important in rebuilding yourself and building that sense of resilience that we seek after trauma.
Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. And it must have been, yeah, it's hard to imagine how emotionally challenging that must have been on so many levels, that experience of helping to reintegrate, an amazingly productive way to channel your own trauma. And it actually leads on to, there's a few questions around reconciliation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So one person's asked whether history needs to be revisited in Bosnia for a genuine reconciliation to emerge and what the best way to go about that might be. And someone else has also asked how you feel about the Forum ZFD initiative, which is based in Cologne in Germany, promoting Bosnia and peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
There's so many initiatives and so many attempts to reconcile Bosnia. So, but there's one major challenge, and that challenge is that the narrative of hatred continues to live in Bosnia. And in some ways, the ethnic cleansing and that narrative were acknowledged and recognized by the Dayton Peace Accord that acknowledged and respects the division that really resulted from genocide and war in Bosnia in 1990s. So Bosnia is today divided. There is nearly half of the country that's called Serb Republic. And the name itself acknowledges that it is a place where Serbs live, and largely it is monoethnic, predominantly Serbs. Many people who lived there before the war are somewhere in the world today. Many have reached out to me and talked about their painful experiences and thanked me for writing this book. And then there is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is sort of the other part of the country that is more multi-ethnic. There are some Serbs still living there, and there are also Bosnian Muslims and Croats. But most young people are leaving Bosnia today. They are they're losing hope that there will be true reconciliation in the country, because on the Serb side, those who committed war crimes like Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milošević, and many others are celebrated. Their names are used to name schools, and they're recognized as heroes. And until we get to a point where a book like The Cat I Never Named becomes part of curriculum for everyone in Bosnia, and genocide is acknowledged as something that had occurred, that is a historic fact, I don't think we will see true reconciliation happen in the country. And of course, there continue to be larger tensions, geopolitical tensions that are playing out in Bosnia, with on the Serb side, Russia being heavily involved and encouraging some of these sentiments and calls for annexation to Serbia. And so the country remains politically and economically unstable, and the story of the Bosnian genocide is not being revisited, and it's not being examined the way that it should be in the educational system, so that we can come together and come to terms and move on to a better shared multi-ethnic future, which is not really happening in Bosnia this time.
And a last question to finish off with is, how do we combat narratives that are fueled by hatred, like Serbia's framing of Bosnia, while highlighting narratives that espouse compassion and empathy? I think, you know, from our discussion, that's a question that has broader relevance beyond just the context of Bosnia.
Mm-hmm. You know, I thanked my team at Bloomsbury, my editor, and everyone involved in this book for giving me a voice with this a story with The Cat I Never Named. But I don't think that my book should be one of few. I think we need to flood the educational system and our social societal narratives with the stories of inclusion, with the stories that inspire collective empathy. I think we lack that, and collective empathy is essential to building to social cohesion. I think the expectation that multi-ethnic societies and increasingly diverse societies, if we look at Western Europe today, that just having the demographic presence of different groups is sufficient to counter hatred. I think it's a mistake to think that way. We need to see representation in curriculum, in education. We need to see representation in political leadership. We need to see representation within the power circles in these societies of diversity, ethnic, religious diversity, in order to immunize ourselves from potentially traumatic events, as we've seen happen even in the United States over the last couple of years. The narrative of Islamophobic narrative, the narrative of racism has been normalized, and we need to counter it. And the only way to counter it is to meaningfully connect with each other. So I would love to see more stories like The Cat I Never Named become mainstreamed in the curriculum in the Western world and the United States in particular.
Thank you so much, Amra, and thank you so much to everybody who submitted questions. I think we had a really fascinating discussion there. And for me, what really came across from hearing Amra talk about her book was not just these incredibly vivid descriptions of war and these unimaginable experiences, but also the kind of resilience that shows through, and the human spirit and the way that people can survive. And I think Amra's own story is really testament to that she's not only kind of survived on a personal level, but really flourished and taken that painful experience and channeled it towards an active process of reconciliation, as we heard her talk about, but also to using that story for a greater good. And I think that there's something that everyone can take away from this story, far beyond learning about the Bosnian genocide. It's a lot of food for thought about our current political moment across the globe. And just really thank you again, Amra, for sharing that with us. And everyone should go and read her book. It's a really compelling read. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, and thank you everyone who asked questions. And if you have other questions, you can easily find me on social media or find my public email at Columbia. I'm happy to continue to engage in this conversation, because I do think it's important that we keep talking about these issues to counter hate that we all are facing in our respective societies. Thank you.
I also wanted to thank you both. Thank you, Samira, for asking some of the difficult questions and leading the conversation. And of course, thank you, Amra, so much for sharing your story. I know how difficult it may be. I also wanted to encourage people to read The Cat I Never Named. I'm halfway through. It's difficult to read, but it's informative, it's very moving, and it also puts things in perspective, especially today as we face, during a pandemic, we think we're facing difficult times, but there are more difficult things that can happen. So I wanted to thank you both. And it's really quite a remarkable story. Thank you. And thank you to our audience.